The late afternoon sun hung low over the gentle undulations of the Cotswolds, spilling its golden light over the rolling fields and the hedgerows that bordered them. It was the kind of autumn day that felt timeless, where the air carried a crispness that hinted at the coming winter, but was tempered by the warm colours of turning leaves. From a distance, Windhurst Manor looked every bit the quintessential English country estate. A stately stone facade cloaked in ivy, tall mullioned windows catching the last rays of sunlight, and a neatly kept gravel drive that wound past rose bushes, topiary, and a small pond where ducks glided silently beneath the reflection of the sky. Miss Jane Marple eased herself from her little Morris Oxford, her gloved hands steady despite the slight chill. At 75 she possessed the unassuming appearance of a gentle old lady, but beneath her calm exterior lay a mind honed by decades of observing human nature in the quiet lanes and parlours of St. Mary Mead. She adjusted her hat, which had a simple ribbon, and smoothed her overcoat. It was a practical coat, dark grey with subtle hints of lavender, a colour she had always favoured for its unobtrusive elegance. "I do hope Lady Evelyn isn't fussed about punctuality," she murmured to herself, recalling the note of invitation she had received some weeks earlier. A woman of her standing, surely she must have more pressing matters than worrying over a guest's arrival. The manor door opened just as she stepped onto the gravel. Lady Evelyn Chatterley, a tall woman of refined manners, appeared, dressed in a cream-coloured tweed coat with a muff of soft, pale fox fur. Her auburn hair was perfectly coiffed, and her eyes, sharp beneath delicately arched brows, betrayed an intelligence often veiled beneath her genteel manner. "Ah, Miss Marple, how delightful to see you!" Lady Evelyn exclaimed, her voice melodic yet brisk. "I do hope your journey wasn't too tiresome." "Not at all, my dear Lady Evelyn," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside the grand hall. "The countryside is always refreshing, and one cannot complain about such charming views." The interior of Windhurst Manor was everything one might expect of an English country house at the height of its grandeur. Polished oak floors gleamed under the soft light of crystal chandeliers. Oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors adorned the walls, and vases of fresh flowers, roses, dahlias, and late-autumn chrysanthemums, stood on ornate tables. A faint scent of polish and faintly burnt wood lingered in the air, a sign that the hearth had been recently tended. "Allow me to take your coat," said Lady Evelyn, leading Miss Marple toward the drawing-room. The room was comfortably furnished, with high-backed chairs and a deep-set fireplace flanked by shelves of leather-bound books. A piano sat in one corner, its surface reflecting the last glow of sunlight filtering through the tall windows. "I imagine you've heard of the family troubles," Lady Evelyn began as she poured tea into delicate porcelain cups. "It seems that wherever one turns in Windhurst Manor there is some minor irritation, or major, depending on the day. Still, you will find it peaceful enough for a few days." Miss Marple accepted the tea with a polite nod. "I have heard vague whispers indeed. You know, Lady Evelyn, even in the quietest of villages, there is always some human drama simmering beneath the surface. One only needs to know where to look or whom to ask." Lady Evelyn smiled faintly, though her eyes flickered with something Miss Marple had seen many times before, a shadow of unease. "You have that remarkable talent for observation, Miss Marple. I am grateful to have your company, if nothing else." Before they could continue, the bell rang sharply, announcing another arrival. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penrose, a tall woman with an efficient manner and iron-grey hair, answered the door to admit a young man. He was clean-shaven, with dark hair and a strikingly confident gait. Miss Marple noted immediately that there was an air of impatience in the way he removed his gloves. "Ah, you must be Richard Fenwick, my cousin's lawyer," Lady Evelyn said, rising to greet him. "How fortunate that you could join us, Richard Fenwick's handshake was firm. "I would not miss this gathering for the world, Lady Evelyn. Windhurst Manor always carries an air of importance, does it not?" His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple, from the corner of her eye, observed the faint twitch in his jaw and the way his fingers drummed lightly against his coat. Subtle signs, yet telling. Soon after, the room began to fill with more guests, each carrying their own invisible burdens, secrets or resentments. There was Mrs. Millicent Crowthorne, a genteel widow with a keen interest in local horticulture. Colonel Arthur Bevington, a retired military officer with an air of self-assured authority. And finally, the young heiress, Clarissa Windhurst, whose delicate features and carefully arranged hair did little to disguise the anxious tension in her expression. As the afternoon waned into evening, Lady Evelyn gathered everyone in the drawing-room for tea. Conversation flowed politely, touching on recent village events, the coming winter, and the upkeep of the estate. Yet beneath the civility, Miss Marple detected subtle undercurrents, veiled glances, half-finished sentences, a stiffness in posture here and there. It was during this time that Miss Marple first became aware of the shadow that would ultimately cast the entire household into disquiet. A sudden, harsh cry echoed from the upper floor. All conversation ceased. Lady Evelyn rose with an alarming swiftness, and Mrs. Penrose hurried to the staircase. "It's Clarissa!" Lady Evelyn exclaimed, her hand clutching her chest. "I thought she was merely resting in her room." Miss Marple followed with her usual quiet decisiveness. On reaching the top landing, they found Clarissa Windhurst slumped across the edge of the balcony rail, overlooking the grand staircase. She was unconscious but breathing, a delicate teacup tipped on the floor beside her, the remnants of tea slowly staining the carpet. Mrs. Penrose gasped. "I don't understand. She simply called for me, and then this." Miss Marple crouched beside the young woman, examining the scene carefully. "It seems she has fainted rather than fallen," she murmured. "But there is something more. Observe the teacup. Note its contents, the manner in which it is tipped, and notice the handkerchief clutched tightly in her hand." Colonel Bevington frowned. "Do you suggest this is no accident, Miss Marple?" "I do not suggest anything yet," Miss Marple replied gently. "One must always consider the obvious first." "But the obvious may sometimes conceal the truth." After Clarissa was attended to and settled in her room, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room. There was a hushed tension, a quiet awareness among the guests that something was amiss. Miss Marple herself was reflecting on the scene. Faint patterns often revealed themselves to a careful observer. The way a person reacted, the things left unsaid, the small, seemingly inconsequential details. She noted Lady Evelyn's anxious pacing, Colonel Bevington's clipped movements, Richard Fenwick's restless hands, and the subtle tremor in Mrs. Crowthorne's voice when she offered assistance. Each behaviour was a thread, and threads often wove into patterns that could reveal the heart of a mystery. As the evening drew on, Miss Marple retired to her room, carrying her small bag of necessities and a notebook. The manor, usually serene in the evening light, seemed charged with an imperceptible tension. Footsteps echoed faintly on the polished floors, and the wind rustled through the trees outside, whispering like a distant reminder that secrets, however well kept, often have a way of revealing themselves. Sitting by the window with a cup of plain tea, Miss Marple reflected quietly. "There is more to this house than a simple fainting spell," she thought. "The threads are tangled, but the fabric will reveal itself in time. I must observe, listen, and above all remember, for human nature once known is never truly hidden." She made notes of every detail, every name, every subtle expression she had observed. It was a habit that had often led her to insights where others saw only confusion. And as the last light faded from the sky, she felt that quiet certainty that only comes to those who have spent a lifetime watching and understanding people. Something at Windhurst Manor was very wrong, and before long she would be called upon to unravel it. The manor, with its stately charm and cultivated gardens, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the story to unfold. And Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom and unwavering patience, was prepared to see it through. The morning after Clarissa's fainting spell dawned clear and brisk. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and smoke from distant chimneys, and the gardens of Windhurst Manor were painted in the warm golds and reds of the season. From her window, Miss Marple could see the staff tending to the grounds with quiet diligence, the rustling of leaves occasionally masking the soft footfalls of the manor's residents. Miss Marple had begun her day with a light breakfast in her small sitting-room. She drank her tea slowly, savouring the warmth, and reflected on the events of the previous evening. Clarissa's collapse was suspicious, she was certain of that much. Yet there was no outward sign of malice, no overturned furniture, no sign of struggle. And still, something in the teacup and the girl's sudden fainting whispered of more than mere accident. When Lady Evelyn entered, carrying a small tray of scones and preserves, her face bore a mixture of concern and composure. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, placing the tray on the table. "I trust you slept well?" "Quite well, thank you, my dear. And how is our young friend this morning?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Still resting. She is pale, but the doctor assures me she will recover fully. It is most perplexing." Lady Evelyn's voice betrayed a faint tremor. "I cannot imagine what could have caused her to collapse in such a manner." Miss Marple nodded, taking a scone. "Sometimes the simplest explanations are not the correct ones, but observation often reveals what speculation cannot." Observations and early suspicions. Miss Marple began her careful observation immediately. The manor, though stately and orderly, was rife with subtle tension. She noticed the way Colonel Bevington lingered near the study door, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes darting frequently toward the stairwell. Richard Fenwick, the lawyer, was restlessly examining the papers left in the drawing-room from the previous day, glancing frequently at Lady Evelyn as though gauging her reaction. Mrs. Millicent Crowthorne, the horticulturist, had taken to wandering the hallways quietly, often pausing before family portraits as if searching for hidden answers among the painted eyes of long-dead ancestors. And Lady Evelyn herself seemed preoccupied with the arrangement of furniture and the placement of vases, a subtle attempt, Miss Marple suspected, to maintain a veneer of order over chaos. As she walked through the corridors, Miss Marple made mental notes of these behaviours. Yes, every glance, every hesitancy, every forced smile could tell a story if one had the patience to listen. The first interviews after morning tea, Miss Marple began her first round of informal interviews. She started with Mrs. Penrose, the housekeeper. "Mrs. Penrose," Miss Marple said softly, "I wonder if you might indulge me with some observations about the household. You see more than anyone else, and the smallest detail may prove useful." Mrs. Penrose, a tall woman with an air of efficiency, nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. I've served the Windhursts for many years. Nothing usually disturbs the household, but last night, well, Clarissa's fainting was most unsettling. She was nervous of late. Yes, but I thought it was merely the pressure of inheriting the estate." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Nervous, you say? In what way?" She seemed jumpy. Miss Marple not herself at all. She asked many questions about her father's papers, about legacies, and about who might have claims on the estate should anything happen to her. Mrs. Penrose's hands clasped tightly. "I cannot help but feel someone is watching her, or perhaps hoping she might falter. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. Next she spoke with Richard Fenwick, whose demeanour suggested he was accustomed to attention yet wished to avoid suspicion. "Mr. Fenwick," Miss Marple began, "I understand. You are the family lawyer. You deal with many sensitive matters, do you not?" "Do you not?" "Oh, yes, indeed," he replied smoothly. "I assure you, Miss Marple, my interests here are entirely professional. I am concerned only with clarifying legal arrangements and ensuring Miss Clarissa's inheritance is properly secured." "And yet you seem uneasy," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Is there something troubling you about these arrangements?" Fenwick paused, then smiled faintly, a practised mask. "Merely the usual stress of responsibility, Miss Marple. I have no personal stake, I assure you, though I cannot deny that such matters sometimes provoke tension among those involved." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, noting the subtle twitch in his jaw and the way his fingers tapped lightly against the papers on the table. Clarissa's condition. By mid-morning, Clarissa was awake, pale but alert. Miss Marple visited her room under the pretext of a friendly call. "A good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "How are you feeling?" "I am well enough, thank you," Clarissa replied, her voice weak but polite. "It was frightful the way I suddenly felt dizzy. I do not understand it at all." "Did you notice anything unusual in your tea?" Miss Marple asked casually as she settled into a chair near the window. Clarissa shook her head. "No, it tasted perfectly normal. No. Yet I remember feeling suddenly very warm, then dizzy, then nothing at all. I was terrified." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And has anyone shown particular concern for your well-being, or perhaps interest in the contents of your father's papers?" Clarissa looked at her, startled. "Oh, why, Miss Marple, you surprise me. Yes, there have been questions, polite but persistent, about my father's arrangements. I find it unsettling." Miss Marple nodded quietly, making a mental note of this. Curiosity, she knew, often masked greed, and even polite interest could conceal dangerous intent. Exploring the manor, the remainder of the morning was spent by Miss Marple quietly exploring Windhurst Manor. She visited the library, noting the positions of books, letters and documents, the kitchen where she observed the staff moving with a quiet efficiency that might conceal worry or complicity, and the garden where she listened to the hushed voices of Colonel Bevington and Mrs. Crowthorne, discussing roses and fencing in tones that seemed almost coded. From each observation, Miss Marple gathered subtle clues. A misplaced letter here, a hastily cleaned teacup there, a nervous glance exchanged between two adults, each tiny detail like a piece of a puzzle scattered across the manor. She also began to understand the interpersonal tensions at play. Colonel Bevington, who had once been close to Lady Evelyn in social circles, seemed protective yet subtly jealous of Clarissa's position. Richard Fenwick, while professing disinterest, showed signs of impatience with delays in Clarissa's legal matters, hinting at a personal stake beyond professional duty. Mrs. Crowthorne, gentle and polite, exhibited subtle anxiety when the subject of inheritance arose, perhaps out of loyalty or some other hidden motive. Lady Evelyn herself, while outwardly gracious, had eyes that occasionally flickered with frustration, as though she were holding back information, either to protect someone or to hide something herself. The first clue, as Miss Marple was about to retire to her room for the afternoon, she paused in the corridor, near Clarissa's door. A faint metallic scent caught her attention, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her frown. Leaning slightly, she noticed a small folded note partially tucked beneath the rug. She picked it up, examining it carefully. It was written in hurried, almost panicked handwriting. Be careful whom you trust. Not all is as it seems. Watch the tea. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. Now we have confirmation, she murmured to herself. Clarissa was warned. This is no accident. She slipped the note into her notebook, her mind already turning over possibilities. Who had left it? A friend wishing to protect her, or someone hoping to manipulate events by raising her fears? And most importantly, who might have the means to use the teacup as a weapon? Setting the stage for investigation by late afternoon, the household had settled into an uneasy calm. Clarissa rested, Lady Evelyn fussed over arrangements, and the other guests continued their polite routines. Yet Miss Marple could sense the tension underlying every gesture, every glance. She retired to her room once more, spreading her notes across the desk. Observations, suspicions, small details, threads waiting to be woven, she murmured. Patience, Jane. The truth will present itself if one is willing to see it. And so the investigation had begun in earnest. In the quiet corners of Windhurst Manor, secrets whispered, loyalties tested, and motives lay hidden, waiting for a keen eye and a patient mind to uncover them. Miss Marple, as always, was both observer and confidant, quietly noting every detail that might one day unravel the tangled web threatening to disturb the peace of the manor. The following day dawned grey and mist-laden, the kind of morning that seemed to cloak Windhurst Manor in secrecy. A damp chill clung to the hedgerows, and the lawn sparkled with dew. Inside the manor, Miss Marple moved quietly from room to room, her mind alert to even the smallest detail. The events of the previous day, the fainting, the hidden note, had set her senses alight. Human nature rarely changed overnight, and secrets once present were seldom truly buried. Hidden tensions surfaced by breakfast. The atmosphere among the household was taut. Colonel Bevington, usually so self-assured, appeared curt and irritable, his eyes often lingering on Clarissa as she ate quietly beside Lady Evelyn. Miss Marple noted how his hand trembled slightly when reaching for the butter, a subtle sign of suppressed anxiety or concealed emotion. Richard Fenwick, in contrast, seemed calm to the point of artifice, yet Miss Marple observed his sharp glances at Clarissa's untouched toast and his almost imperceptible sigh when the conversation turned to estate matters. Such contrasts, exterior composure hiding interior concern, often revealed more than overt suspicion ever could. Mrs. Millicent Crowthorne, meanwhile, busied herself with floor arrangements at the breakfast table, her hands fluttering over the tablecloth, as if seeking reassurance. Tea, Miss Marple? Tea, Miss Marple? She asked, her voice too bright, too strained. Miss Marple smiled gently, declining. No, thank you, Millicent. I find myself more interested in the morning papers. Yet her eyes never left the older woman, noting every twitch of the lips, every hesitation in speech, every glance toward the stairwell where Clarissa had nearly fallen. Even Lady Evelyn's careful composure held cracks. She adjusted her gloves repeatedly. sighed softly, and occasionally bit her lower lip in a gesture of private worry. Miss Marple suspected she was guarding something, perhaps a family secret, or a truth too delicate for public display. The first red herring as mid-morning approached, Miss Marple took a quiet walk in the garden. The mist hung low, curling around the rose bushes and hedgerows, and the air was damp and earthy. It was here that she encountered the first apparent clue, or red herring. A small bottle lay partially hidden in the corner of the garden shed. Its label was worn and indistinct, but the faint residue of powder inside suggested potential toxicity. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, noting the fingerprints and examining the cork. "This could be significant or not," she murmured to herself. Often, the simplest discovery leads one astray. Returning inside, she presented the bottle to Lady Evelyn. "Oh, my word, where did you find this?" Lady Evelyn exclaimed, her hands fluttering nervously. "It must be from the gardener's shed. Oh, must be from the gardener's shed. He's been cleaning and organising. Probably forgot to remove it from last year's treatments." Miss Marple studied her quietly. "It is possible, of course, but it is also possible that someone intended for it to be found or overlooked be true. Curiosity is a dangerous thing when it comes to substances like this. No one else seemed to know of its presence. The bottle was placed in the study for safekeeping, yet Miss Marple filed it in her mind, not as evidence necessarily, but as a symbol of the manor's latent secrets. Uncovering subtle clues by late morning, Miss Marple had begun interviewing the other residents more deeply. She first spoke with Clarissa, who, though recovering, seemed uneasy. Clarissa, did you notice anyone in particular at the time of your fainting? Anyone acting oddly?" Miss Marple asked gently. Clarissa hesitated, eyes downcast. "I remember Richard standing near the tea tray, but he was talking to Lady Evelyn. And Colonel Bevington, he looked anxious, but he seemed more concerned than anything else." Miss Marple nodded. "And Mrs. Crowthorne, did she visit you?" "Yes, she brought some flowers and asked how I was. But she glanced strangely, I thought, as though she was watching me and watching someone else too." This was precisely the kind of ambiguous observation Miss Marple noted carefully. Each person's reaction could reveal multiple possibilities: concern, guilt, or deceit. A secret revealed later that afternoon. Miss Marple took a walk in the library, where she discovered a hidden drawer in an old bureau. Inside were letters dating back several years, correspondence between Clarissa's late father and a mysterious business associate. The letters hinted at financial irregularities and the potential for significant disputes over the estate. The handwriting varied, some letters hurried, some precise. Miss Marple read through them slowly, making careful notes. Among the papers was a reference to a contingency, a clause that might affect Clarissa's inheritance in the event of an untimely accident or illness. This discovery added layers to the mystery. A potential motive for someone within the manor to wish ill upon Clarissa, and perhaps an explanation for the note she had received warning her to be careful of the tea. Interpersonal strains. Miss Marple's observations grew sharper as the day continued. She noticed subtle power plays among the household. Colonel Bevington seemed protective, yet there was a hint of resentment when he observed Lady Evelyn assisting Clarissa. Was it loyalty or something more? Richard Fenwick's calm professionalism occasionally gave way to flashes of impatience, as though he were eager for Clarissa to make decisions favourable to him. Mrs. Crowthorne's gentle demeanour masked a hidden tension whenever financial matters arose. Miss Marple suspected she may have known more about the family's affairs than she let on. Lady Evelyn herself was perhaps the most enigmatic, balancing concern with guarded secrecy. Miss Marple realized that each person, while seemingly polite and restrained, had a possible motive and opportunity, classic elements in any tangled human drama. Another incident late that evening, just as the household settled for dinner, a sudden noise echoed from the study, a clatter, followed by a startled cry. Guests rushed to the scene to find a stack of papers scattered across the floor. Clarissa had entered to retrieve a letter and found it missing from its usual place. "Someone has moved my father's letters," she exclaimed, panic rising in her voice. Miss Marple examined the scattered papers and noted that one particular document was absent, the one referencing the contingency clause in the inheritance. "The plot thickens," she murmured quietly to herself, "and the game is now clearly afoot." Each new event, each small disruption confirmed what she had suspected. Someone within the house had a hidden agenda, and the fainting incident was likely no accident at all. Hints of poisoning? Miss Marple returned to the tea tray from the previous evening. She examined the teacup that Clarissa had used, noting the fine porcelain, the residue of the liquid, and the faint scent of almonds, an observation that made her pause. Certain poisons carried that subtle aroma, she knew, yet one must be cautious not to leap to conclusions. A misstep here could lead to false accusations. She resolved to keep a watchful eye, observing who handled the tea, who might have access to it, and who seemed unusually attentive to Clarissa's needs. Misleading clues and deceptions as Act 3 continued to unfold. Miss Marple carefully documented a series of red herrings. The garden bottle, initially suspicious, it was likely harmless, left behind by the gardener, yet its discovery distracted the household and prompted subtle tension. Colonel Bevington's behaviour, protective yet resentful, his exaggerated concern made him appear suspicious but may have been entirely genuine. Mrs. Crowthorne's anxiety, her tension suggested knowledge or worry, but it could be out of loyalty or fear rather than guilt, or fear rather than guilt. The hidden letters, while revealing potential motives, they also misled the household by implying certain people had financial ambitions they may not actually have possessed. Miss Marple understood that each red herring served to obscure the truth, but they also illuminated human nature. In observing how each individual responded to these disruptions, she gained insight into who was capable of deceit and who was merely entangled in circumstance. The key realization by the close of the day, Miss Marple had begun to see the outlines of the mystery more clearly. Clarissa's fainting was unlikely an accident. Someone had both opportunity and motive, and the web of household tensions provided cover for manipulation. Yet Miss Marple also sensed that the true culprit would not reveal themselves through direct action. Instead, it would be subtle, a careless remark, a lingering glance, a hesitancy in speech. And when that person acted out of impulse or overconfidence, the threads would be laid bare. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple made a careful tally of the household, their movements, their motives, and the small details that could betray intention. "One must never underestimate the quiet ones," she murmured. The truth hides where it is least expected, and often those who seem most polite carry the sharpest cunning. The morning after the latest incident dawned clear, with sunlight slicing through the windows of Windhurst Manor, catching the edges of the crystal chandeliers and glinting off the polished wood of the grand staircase. The air, though crisp, carried an undercurrent of tension. Windhurst Manor had become a theatre in which every gesture, every glance, and every word might serve as a clue or a trap. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her notebook open, reviewed her carefully gathered observations. Over the past 3 days she had noted every hesitation, every glance, and every subtle gesture of the household's residents. From the fainting of young Clarissa to the mysterious note, the misplaced letters, and the sudden disturbances in the study, a picture was beginning to emerge, a picture of human motives tangled like the ivy on the manor walls. Piecing together motives, Miss Marple reflected quietly on the motives she had uncovered. Colonel Bevington, protective of Clarissa, yet subtly resentful of the attention she received from Lady Evelyn. His concern appeared genuine, though the occasional flash of irritation could suggest more complex feelings. Richard Fenwick, the lawyer's exterior calm, belied impatience and an eagerness for Clarissa to make decisions that might favour him professionally or personally. He had access to the estate papers and the opportunity to manipulate events. Mrs. Millicent Crowthorne, gentle, anxious, perhaps loyal, yet her repeated glances at Clarissa and her nervous behaviour hinted she might know more than she let on. Lady Evelyn Chatterley, outwardly composed and gracious, yet her eyes had betrayed a careful monitoring of events, and she seemed intent on controlling who accessed information. Each motive alone was insufficient to implicate anyone, but when combined with opportunity and subtle clues, a pattern was emerging. The clues aligned. Miss Marple began to organise her notes, laying out the incidents in sequence. The fainting, Clarissa collapses after drinking tea. Subtle scent of almonds detected. Warning note left earlier, the garden bottle, likely harmless, yet a distraction that could conceal other intentions. The scattered letters, hidden correspondence, hinted at disputes over inheritance and a contingency clause. Behavioral clues, anxiety, restlessness, protective gestures, and subtle glances revealed underlying tensions. All of these threads converged to suggest one critical point. Clarissa had been subtly targeted, likely by someone who wished to gain control of her inheritance or influence her decisions regarding the estate. And the fainting, previously considered possibly accidental, was now far more suspect. The moment of insight, Miss Marple spent the morning quietly observing the household. She noted the placement of the teacups, the way Richard Fenwick lingered near the study papers, and the furtive glances exchanged between Mrs. Crowthorne and Lady Evelyn. Her keen mind began to assemble the pieces. "Ah, it is not always the most obvious suspicion," she murmured to herself. "Often, the person who appears most composed is the one who has been carefully orchestrating events, and the smallest slip can reveal everything." Her intuition directed her attention to the tea service from the previous evening. The faint scent of almonds had been a subtle yet telling clue. In her quiet years in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned to recognize the smallest indicators of mischief. The fainting had all the hallmarks of an attempted poisoning, but not a clumsy one. This had been carefully staged, designed to appear accidental, with a warning note planted to create fear rather than immediate action. Interviewing suspects again, Miss Marple decided it was time to speak directly with the household. She began with Colonel Bevington. "Colonel," she said gently, "may I ask you a question? Were you aware of anyone handling Clarissa's tea last evening?" The Colonel's eyes narrowed. "I was nearby, yes, but I assure you I had no hand in it. I was concerned for her well-being, not anything else." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course I am certain of your concern. You are protective, but protective alone does not explain the sequence of events that have unfolded." Colonel Bevington seemed momentarily flustered, though he quickly regained composure. Miss Marple noted the tension and moved on, understanding that he likely played no role but was entangled in the emotional web of the household. Next, she spoke with Mrs. Crowthorne. "Millicent," she began softly, "you have observed much of what has transpired. Did anything strike you as unusual about the tea or the letters?" Mrs. Crowthorne shook her head, eyes wide. "No, only that I felt uneasy. Something felt wrong, but I did not know what. I only wanted to ensure Clarissa was safe." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Sometimes people see more than they realize. Did you notice anyone unusually interested in Clarissa's inheritance or the contingency clause?" Mrs. Crowthorne hesitated, then shook her head again. "I cannot say. I only know that Clarissa was frightened." The final piece, Miss Marple then considered Richard Fenwick. There was something in his precise, controlled manner that suggested careful planning. She remembered the way he had examined the estate papers and the faint flicker of impatience when discussing the inheritance. She requested a quiet moment with him in the drawing-room. "Mr. Fenwick," she said, her tone polite yet firm, "you have access to the papers and the tea service, have you not?" Fenwick's hands stiffened. "Yes, but I assure you I have no intention to harm anyone. I am here purely professionally." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Professional duty is admirable, Mr. Fenwick. Yet even the most meticulous planning can falter if one underestimates the quiet observer." She paused, watching his reaction closely. There was a flicker of unease, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a micro-expression that betrayed worry rather than innocence. The fainting, the note, the letters, they all point to a careful manipulation of events, she continued. "Whoever did this hoped the blame would fall elsewhere, perhaps even on accidents or nerves. Yet a small detail always slips, and I believe I have seen it." Fenwick's face paled slightly. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "You were aware that Clarissa had access to information that could alter her inheritance. You knew the teacup could be handled, the tea laced, yet you created a situation that seemed harmless. All the while you relied on others to provide cover for your actions." The fainting was intended to intimidate, to unsettle, and to gain an advantage. The lawyer's composure broke, his fingers curling tightly. "Miss Marple, that is preposterous. I did not." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. But one cannot hide behind words when the smallest slip, the faintest glance tells the truth." You underestimated how closely one can observe, even in the quietest household. Confrontation. Miss Marple summoned Lady Evelyn, Colonel Bevington, Mrs. Crowthorne, and Clarissa to the drawing-room. The atmosphere was taut, the kind of quiet charged with anticipation one finds only in houses where secrets have lingered too long. My friends, Miss Marple began, the events of the past days, the fainting of Clarissa, the warning note, the scattered letters, were not accidents. They were carefully orchestrated to unsettle the household and manipulate the outcome of her inheritance. The group shifted uneasily. Clarissa's hands trembled as she held her teacup, eyes wide with fear and anticipation. Richard Fenwick, Miss Marple continued, you hoped to gain influence over Clarissa's decisions. The fainting was staged and the note was planted to create fear rather than action. Your careful attention to a T, your subtle manipulation of documents, all betray a mind intent on control rather than professional duty. Fenwick's face drained of colour. It was for her own protection, he stammered. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Protection is not forcing someone into fear and uncertainty. Your actions, though subtle, were deliberate. And in doing so you underestimated the quiet observer who notices the smallest of slips, the tiniest hint of intent. Resolution of suspense. Fenwick's guilt became evident in his trembling hands and the downward cast of his eyes. Lady Evelyn, though shocked, expressed relief that the truth had been uncovered. Colonel Bevington nodded silently, reassured that Clarissa was safe, and Mrs. Crowthorne allowed a small sigh of relief to escape. Clarissa herself, though shaken, felt vindicated and safe, having been spared the worst of Fenwick's manipulations. Miss Marple, ever gentle in her wisdom, addressed the household. Human nature is complex, she said softly. Sometimes those who appear the most composed are capable of subtle mischief. Yet the truth has a way of revealing itself, often in the smallest details that cannot be faked or hidden from a patient observer. Miss Marple's reflection later, as the sun set and cast a warm glow across the manor, Miss Marple sat quietly in her room, reflecting on the events. She noted how motives, opportunity, and subtle human behaviour had intertwined to create the mystery, and how observation, patience, and understanding of character had unveiled the truth. Windhurst Manor, once shrouded in secrecy and tension, now seemed to breathe more easily. The household, aware of the revelation, moved with a newfound honesty, the tension replaced with cautious relief. Miss Marple, her mind ever alert, sipped her tea and murmured to herself, the quiet ones always see the most. And sometimes seeing is all that is needed to unravel the most tangled of webs. The morning sun rose over Windhurst Manor with a gentle, forgiving light. After the tense events of the previous days, the estate seemed to breathe again, though the shadows of suspicion still lingered faintly in the corners of the drawing-room and along the polished corridors. Miss Marple, ever alert, spent the early hours in quiet reflection, reviewing her notes and the evidence that had led to the revelation of Richard Fenwick's subtle manipulations. Despite the dramatic confrontation, the household still required reassurance and explanation. Miss Marple knew that the peace of the manor depended not only on uncovering the truth, but on guiding the residents toward understanding and closure. Explaining the crime gathering the household in the drawing-room, Miss Marple began her calm, deliberate recounting of the mystery. Clarissa sat beside Lady Evelyn, her hands neatly folded, while Colonel Bevington and Mrs. Crowthorne watched attentively. Richard Fenwick, seated quietly, avoided direct eye contact, his expression a mixture of resignation and guilt. My friends, Miss Marple began, the events that have distressed this household over the past few days were not random nor accidental. Clarissa's fainting, the mysterious note, and the displaced letters were all part of a carefully orchestrated plan to influence the young lady's decisions regarding her inheritance. She held up the folded note found in Clarissa's room. This warning was placed to frighten her, not protect her. It created anxiety and confusion, ensuring that those observing could manipulate her more easily. Such small acts, seemingly innocuous, can have powerful effects. Turning her gaze toward Fenwick, she continued, Mr. Fenwick had access to both the tea and the estate papers. The fainting was staged using a subtle, fast-acting compound, harmless in small doses but alarming enough to cause dizziness and collapse. The intention was not to harm permanently, but to create fear, uncertainty and dependence. Clarissa's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of relief and shock crossing her face. But why? Why would you do this?" she whispered. "A control, my dear," Miss Marple explained. "Influence over your decisions regarding the estate, a subtle encouragement to follow directions favourable to Mr. Fenwick's interests." Yet, while he believed the manipulation would remain unseen, even the most careful plan leaves traces, micro-expressions, gestures, hesitations, and the like. "And I have been observing them all." Fenwick's confession faced with the calm, yet precise explanation. Fenwick could no longer maintain his composure. He rose slowly, hands clasped tightly. "Yes, it is true," he admitted, voice trembling. "I did not wish to harm Clarissa, only to guide her decisions, and so I believed I could manage the situation without causing alarm. I was wrong. I see that now." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Acknowledging the truth is always preferable to denial, Mr. Fenwick, and sometimes a lesson learned in humility is more enduring than any legal reprimand." Lady Evelyn, with a mixture of relief and lingering concern, added, "I had my suspicions, but I feared to confront him too hastily. I am grateful, Miss Marple, for your keen insight and discretion. You have spared our household from further turmoil." Colonel Bevington placed a hand gently on Clarissa's shoulder. "And you, my dear, are safe now. That is what matters most. Settling the estate once the immediate danger was removed, the matter of Clarissa's inheritance and the estate papers required careful attention." Miss Marple guided the household through the clarification of the documents, ensuring that the contingency clauses were understood and that Clarissa's authority over her father's estate remained secure. Richard Fenwick, having confessed, agreed to provide any information necessary for legal clarification. The household breathed more freely, and a sense of order returned to Windhurst Manor. Miss Marple watched the interactions quietly, noting the subtle easing of tension in the group. Mrs. Crowthorne smiled gently, no longer anxious. Lady Evelyn moved with a newfound composure. Colonel Bevington's eyes held warmth rather than restrained concern. And Clarissa, though still a little shaken, now radiated relief and confidence. Restoring calm with the crisis resolved, Miss Marple suggested a small garden gathering in the late afternoon, a quiet tea in the sunshine to restore routine and ease the household's nerves. The mist of the early morning had lifted, and the gardens were bright with autumn colours. As they walked among the rose bushes and trimmed hedgerows, Miss Marple offered gentle reflections. "A human nature, as you may have seen, is a complex thing," she said softly. "Even those who appear calm and composed can harbour ambitions and fears. Yet kindness, observation, and patience often reveal the truth more swiftly than confrontation or accusation alone." Clarissa listened attentively. "I never imagined someone could manipulate events so quietly. Thank you, Miss Marple, for seeing what I could not." Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It is rarely about cunning alone, my dear. It is about noticing what others overlook, the small gestures, the fleeting expressions, the patterns that emerge when one pays attention." Farewells and reflection by evening, the household had returned to a tentative calm. The manor, once tense and suspicious, now hummed with quiet order. Miss Marple packed her modest belongings, preparing for her return journey to St. Mary Mead. Lady Evelyn escorted her to the car. "We owe you a great debt, Miss Marple. Without your insight, I fear we might never have understood what was happening here." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Observation and patience, Lady Evelyn. That is often enough to untangle even the most intricate webs. And Windhurst Manor, I must say, has been a most instructive setting." Clarissa approached her expression sincere. "I shall never forget your kindness and wisdom. I hope one day I can understand human nature as you do." Miss Marple chuckled softly, her voice warm. "Ah, my dear, experience and patience are the greatest teachers. And sometimes a quiet mind is all that is required to see clearly." A quiet departure as the motor car trundled down the gravel drive. Miss Marple gazed at the manor one last time. The ivy clung to the stone walls, the gardens glimmered in the fading light, and the household moved with restored calm. All was in its proper place once more. She reflected on the events of the past days, the fainting incident, the warning note, the scattered letters, and the subtle manipulations. Every element had been a thread woven together to conceal the truth. Yet careful observation and patient reasoning had unravelled it all. A human nature, she murmured to herself, is both delicate and revealing. Secrets seldom remain hidden forever. And sometimes the quiet ones, those who watch and listen, are the ones who truly see. The manor faded into the distance as Miss Marple's car carried her back along the winding Cotswold lanes, the sun sinking low behind the hills. The estate, now peaceful, had returned to the gentle rhythm of country life, and in the quiet heart of the English countryside another mystery had been solved, leaving the human spirit, frail, complex, and yet resilient, untroubled once more.